From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already a subscriber to Free Expression, please sign up at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcast listening. This week, the economy's stupid. Well, the state of the economy usually dominates the conservative voters in an election year, and it typically drives the decisions of swing voters in particular, as James Carville's famous campaign slogan put it 3 decades ago. And once again this year, Americans say it is the biggest issue for them as they prepare to vote in next month's election. So what is the state of the US economy right now, 3 weeks before Election Day? Kamala Harris and Joe Biden insist that things are just great. Growth continues, jobs are plentiful, and unemployment is low. Most Americans don't buy this. A Gallup poll last month found that voters' perceptions of the state of the economy are more negative than they've been in any presidential election since 2008, when we were in the midst of the global financial crisis. Though the rate of inflation is falling, prices are still climbing and remain more than 20% higher than they were when Donald Trump left office 4 years ago. Wages have risen, but there's been no significant increase in real disposable incomes. So what is the real state of the economy right now, and where is it headed? What would a Trump or Harris presidency mean for the economic outlook in the next few years? I'm pleased to say this week that with me to discuss this is one of the country's most astute economists. Jason Thomas is the head of global research at the Carlyle Group. Before joining Carlyle, a private equity group, he worked in the George W. Bush administration in the White House, in fact, with primary responsibility for public finance policy at the National Economic Council. He's written and published widely on the US and global economy and markets, and including, I'm glad to say, of course, for the Wall Street Journal opinion page. And he joins me now. Jason, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start, as I said in my introduction, with the current state of the economy. It is a bit of a conundrum, at least in terms of the politics or the perceptions of it. The economy has enjoyed reasonably good growth for several years now since the pandemic. Unemployment remains very low by sort of long-term historical standards. We had another good employment report for September, which we just had. Inflation is coming down, significantly down from its peak. Interest rates, Fed has started to cut interest rates as well. So that all usually is a kind of a feel-good combination. And yet all the evidence is from the polling, from surveys, from consumer confidence surveys, people don't feel good. Is that just because of the fact that prices, despite the fact that the rate of inflation is coming down, are still 20% higher than they were 4 years ago? Or is there something broader going on, do you think?
I do think it is inflation. And what I'm reminded of when I was working in the White House National Economic Council, how people maybe 20 to 30 years older than me, I'm in my mid-40s right now, were absolutely terrified of doing anything that would spur inflation. At that time, I was...
That's my generation. And I can say I remember the 70s very, very well.
So it took this episode for me, someone in my contemporaries, to really appreciate the extent to which the electorate, the broader body politic, really hates these spikes in inflation. And so I think it was certainly a learning experience for me, but it does remind me of just there was always this symmetry with economic policy, that on the one hand, you don't want to do too little. So you have a sluggish recovery, output growth is too slow as relative to what's necessary to create jobs, but you don't want to do too much. And in many ways, doing too much could actually be the worst of the two options.
Again, you think that is why there's this continuing discontent with economic conditions because, again, it's not even that prices, we have got an inflation rate now down about around 3, obviously lower than it was, but the price level is still that much higher. People feel that they haven't had a big increase in wages to compensate for that. So they just feel when they go to the stores, they feel poorer.
Households are not similarly situated. We have this wide dispersion of experience. Not every household has the same consumption bundle. They're buying very different things. Not every household has exposure to assets that of course, have appreciated and offset some of the increase in the price level. So there certainly are strata of the income distribution where you've seen 25% increase in their price level and something like a 16% increase in their income. Well, that's a negative real income shock of nearly 10%. Not hard to explain why someone in that circumstance would be unhappy with current economic circumstances. And so, again, I don't think it's more complicated than that. I think that we can learn from this that we've had this long period with such low inflation. Inflation seemed to be a problem that really only was mismanaged or, developing economies. It was not something that we really had to worry about any longer. And now I think we've been reminded of the extent to which the electorate, again, broader economic agents really despise this phenomenon.
What's your sense of where the economy is right now? We've had repeated fears of recession over the last year or so. Interest rates have been quite high historically for the last couple of years. Real interest rates, particularly in the last 6 months or so, as inflation has come down. We've had appeared to be a sort of stretched labour market for quite a long time. Normally, you'd expect that to turn around. We've had these sort of market conditions which often indicate recession is in the offing. You know, the famous inverted bond curve, which we don't need to go into too much detail, but basically with short-term rates being higher than long-term rates, that's kind of de-inverted slightly now. But how big is the risk of recession? Is inflation conquered? Are we in for a kind of, long period of sort of stable, low inflationary growth again?
I think that to answer this question, we really have to appreciate how it was that this economy was able to weather interest rates that in 2019 it obviously couldn't. And what I mean by that is the last cycle, the interest rate base rate, the Fed funds rate, peaked at 2.4%. Lots of signs the economy couldn't handle that. So in 2019, the Fed cut rates 3 times. So at that time, 1.75 was sort of the nominal rate that people thought was, what could be sustained for periods of time. In 2022, of course, we started to go well above those levels. At that time, professional forecasters, using models calibrated on pre-pandemic data, expected that we'd go into recession. That didn't happen. So again, why was that? I think there's 2 reasons. The first is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. The fact that you have this large swath of households, for the most part in the middle of the income distribution, who are really just totally insulated from interest rate increases. And fixed rate mortgages do account for about 70% of household liabilities. So that was important. But secondly, and even more importantly, in terms of explaining this growth, has been this extraordinary growth in fixed industrial investment, which today is at generational highs, 3 times the level in terms of assets being put in place that we observed in 2019. Where did this come from? First, it was really the supply chain crisis, the recognition among management teams that the system, just-in-time inventories, was just too fragile. They needed larger inventories, more warehouses to store those inventories, more redundancy in the production process. But secondly, of course, it was industrial policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, the subsidies it provides through the tax code for renewable energy generation, for green industry. So now you have all of these projects for solar, for storage, record additions to the grid in 2024 in the United States, battery plants, EV plants, of course, subsidies for semiconductor fabrication plants added to the mix. And then you have this almost insatiable desire for data center capacity. The hardware like GPUs, applications, and then infrastructure, just having to physically construct these facilities, of course, to train AI models. So I think it's a case where a relatively small share of GDP is just growing so rapidly that it's making this outsized contribution to growth.
I want to go on to those big structural changes you talked about. Again, just very well explained there why the economy's proved resilient in the last couple of years. Again, is it your expectation that it will continue to see that? And particularly, if we took at key variables, we can expect to see continued growth, continued employment growth, continued relatively low unemployment. And do you think the inflation rate will continue to decline and the Fed will be able to cut interest rates further? Just give us your sense of, the next year or so.
Sure. So of course, the economy could fall into recession.
Right.
I just think at this moment in time, it's going to take an outsized shock for that to happen. The reason I say that, you have a fiscal deficit, CBO just reported, of 6.5% of GDP. Now, one could say that's the same proportion of the economy as the 2011, 2012. But of course, the U.S. economy was very depressed then. The deficits were so large because you had very high unemployment, very low tax receipts, very high social spending on means-tested programs. Today, that deficit is being run at full employment on a just discretionary basis. So you have a deficit that's about 2.5 times larger. That means the Treasury, in effect, is injecting $1.5 trillion of incremental liquidity into the economy. This provides some tailwinds, as you might expect. It's not sustainable, but of course, this is a reason to suspect the near-term outlook isn't going to be so bad. Secondly, I mentioned that all that spending, the AI-related spending, industrial policy, this is still going to go on. The CEOs of some of the mega-cap technology companies were asked, where are the applications? Where are the revenues necessary to justify all of this spending? Because the increment is extraordinary. 4 companies are combined to spend $240 billion over the next 12 months. Essentially, they said that they felt they're in a technological arms race. The risk of underinvestment far exceeds the risk of overinvestment. So that's going to continue. Then I think the other point I would make about the near-term outlook, you just had two major revisions from the major statistical agencies in the United States. First, the BLS said that the employment numbers were actually overstated by 800,000 jobs. So people naturally thought, okay, well, if the number of people employed was overstated, then GDP was probably overstated as well. No, actually, the Bureau of Economic Analysis reached the opposite conclusion.
Productivity.
Exactly. So the economy was 1.3% larger than they thought. Yeah. The reason this is important is because generally when you expect downturns in the labor market or heading into recession, it's when productivity numbers start to turn over, start to fall. It's because businesses realize, that last 10% of additions to our labor force, we didn't really have the revenues to support them. And now we have to cut back. This is quite the opposite. This is suggesting that actually there's more revenues than we thought to support that incremental hiring. So for all those reasons, I do feel fairly positive about the near-term output outlook. And, I think with inflation, we're not yet at target. Core PCE on an annual basis is still 2.7%. And I think, with the recent labor report, so also the recent agreement that the longshoremen reached, which is, I think, an important benchmark for the broader transportation and warehousing sector, there could be some more work to be done here. So again, relatively, I'd say fairly constructive as it relates to GDP, to output, to employment. I think some wariness about whether, we're actually really headed back down to that 2% target.
And the structural changes you're talking about, we're going to come on and talk about them in a little more detail. The things you've talked about, the sort of the reshoring that has resulted in obviously a significant increase in domestic investment, some of the domestic policies, they are arguably, and probably unarguably, sort of long-term, potentially, if not inflationary, then certainly more likely to create, we saw this extraordinary period of disinflation from the 1990s to the mid-20-teens, with this extraordinary period driven in large part by the fact that there was this incredibly plentiful supplies of labor, capital, and everything with the tendency to reduce the rate of inflation. If we are going back, and we don't have to talk necessarily about deglobalization, but if we are doing the things that you've talked about here with much more domestic investment, much more focus on domestic production, that probably doesn't augur well for inflation in the medium term, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think it's important to note that when we think about trade and the growth in trade volumes over the last 25, 30 years, it really has been driven not by the trade in finished goods, as we were told by classical economists to expect. The Ricardian idea, one country makes wine, another textiles, and you trade that. Yeah. It's been driven by unbundling of production processes and outsourcing. So you had companies in the United States that became very specialized in product development, very often software development, product design. Then, of course, contracted with third parties. They were labeled OEMs, ODMs elsewhere in the world to manufacture. They, of course, outsourced much of their lower value-added activity. And so you had this longer and longer production processes, value chains. But the net effect of this was to drive down the price of durable goods by about 40%. So we're not talking about disinflation or lower inflation. We're talking about lower prices. Lower prices. Yeah. And so if you undo this process, because now there's a political consensus that there's some antipathy, of course, towards this outsourcing. It's vilified fairly broadly. That's fine. And I think it's an understandable political response. But this comes with trade-offs. And I think one of the issues today is there's a narrative coherence. If we can all agree that outsourcing is bad, well, therefore, there's nothing good about it. And we miss that this is likely to mean far less deflation in durable goods prices, and as a result, perhaps more sticky inflation prospectively than we expect.
Just one very quick point on, you mentioned that one of the reasons that the economic performance has been better, demand growth has been stronger in the last few years than perhaps one might have expected with the interest rates, is one factor, not by any means the only one, but one factor has been industrial policy and the investment in the grid and green energy, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, as it's called. Again, this is a hot topic politically. Democratic economists would say, so, Bidenomics has worked. I mean, it's doing these long-term investments that are going to help the economy, and it's actually been propelling the economy in the short term. What's your assessment of quote-unquote Bidenomics?
Well, I think it's true. I think it's inarguable that this has had a positive effect on capital formation, domestic investment, and again, industrial fixed investment in these facilities. The risk we run is twofold. The first is, what are the returns on this investment ultimately going to be? You can see a range of outcomes. And certainly there are a lot of skeptics as it relates to EVs, some of the battery facilities, those sorts of things. So the verdict is out on what the returns here will be. But again, I think that's more of a 3 to 5 year problem. Yeah. This investment will continue in the short run. Secondly, when you think about the impact of interest rates, what impact have the higher interest rates had on the economy? Well, it's really dented residential investment. It's dented real estate development more broadly. In peak to trough since 2022, there was about a 30% decline in housing starts. One would suspect that that leads to a big decline in construction employment. That hasn't been the case. Construction employment has actually been growing at twice the rate of overall payrolls.
Because of industrial.
Exactly. So to the extent that interest rates lead to a pickup in real estate transactions and then a pickup in real estate development activity, well, this could actually be more inflationary than we suspect, because rather than these people sitting on the sidelines, they're actually busy constructing data centers, renewable energy facilities, et cetera.
You mentioned those two factors. Couldn't there be a third one too, which is that this has all been bought, if you like, this heavy investment at a significant cost in terms of fiscal deterioration in the fiscal position? I mean, we now have a deficit to GDP ratio of, 6.5%, 7%, which is, the kind of thing you see either in a deep recession or in wartime. We've never had anything in a time when the economy is growing and we're in peacetime. We've never seen anything like that. Isn't that a risk? And again, especially as you've just said, with interest rates being much higher, debt service costs are going to be greater. Isn't that all creating a real looming sort of fiscal wall that the US has to climb?
Yes, of course. I would say that the problem, in my opinion, with the discourse on the deficit is that it's almost binary. On one hand, you have people who say nothing to see here, everything's fine, and then those who want to catastrophize the situation, say that we're headed for some sort of blow up and disaster looms. And obviously a lot of crypto enthusiasts very, very keen on putting that in the discourse.
Yeah.
What I think we're talking about here is interest rates that have to be higher than they otherwise would be. What I think is so interesting, if you look through our own history, or if you look cross-sectionally, what you find is that deficit reduction on the requisite scale really only occurs when it's perceived as necessary to reduce borrowing costs. And the classic example in my career, of course, was the early 90s. President Clinton, he recognized tax increases, no fun.
Yep.
Spending cuts, no fun.
Yeah.
But
and in fact, he flipped. If you remember, he was elected in 1992 on a kind of, stimulus idea. And within 3 months, Alan Greenspan and Bob Rubin had convinced him that no, the thing to do was to cut the deficit for precisely the reason you're talking.
Exactly. And the pledge at that time, or when he was selling the package, it was to get long-term interest rates below 7%. So the inducement, the sweetener for the electorate was you can afford that house because mortgage rates will be lower.
Yeah.
You'll be able to buy that car because your auto loan rates will be lower. And so I think that that's what we're setting up for here. The eventual recognition that if we want rates back to what many people consider more normal levels, it's actually going to require fiscal consolidation. This isn't just on the Fed. The Fed has an inflation target to worry about. As long as you're pumping this much incremental liquidity into the economy on the fiscal side, the Fed's going to be in a more reactive posture, again, having to keep rates a bit higher than we would otherwise expect.
It's very interesting. Do you think that, it's funny, I mentioned James Carville in the introduction, and The Economy Stupid brings to mind another famous James Carville line around that time of the early 90s when Clinton was deciding to go for a deficit reduction plan, and much to Carville's opposition. And Carville said that famous line about, I used to think I wanted to come back. If I had a second life, I want to come back as a 400 baseball hitter or rock star. Now I want to come back as the bond market because the bond market seems to be in this problem. You don't think we're there yet, but do you think it would require some kind of evidence that interest rates were somehow staying high because of concerns about the fiscal outlook? It would be only that would provide the kind of political incentive and impulse for them to actually do anything about the deficit.
That's right. That's exactly what I expect. So I think 2 more rate cuts are coming for sure. I just think that there's going to be an end to the road that arrives much sooner than many people expect. It wasn't long ago that there was 10 rate cuts that were priced in. And I suspect that's more than the Fed is going to be able to achieve. And we'll reach a point where people just sort of recognize that 4.25% interest rates is about all the Fed can do while still maintaining adherence to their inflation target.
Sorry to interrupt, Jason, but is that both because inflation, for other reasons you've talked about, particularly with wages remaining sort of fairly robust, is that partly because of inflation not coming down as fast as they think, but also because of, will the fiscal element be a conscious factor in the Fed's rate approach, do you think, over the next couple of years? It's
been interesting to compare the Fed today relative to the Fed 20 or 30 years ago. The Humphrey Hawkins semi-annual testimony was always a stern lecture to Congress about you need to get your fiscal house in order.
Yeah.
We don't see that today.
Yeah.
And so I think that we're at the start of a process of the Fed explaining to policymakers and perhaps broader market participants that if you want rates lower, It's going to require some more help on the fiscal side from the fiscal authorities. We're not there yet. This topic really hasn't even been breached, again, by the Fed chair or policymakers more generally.
Again, earlier this year when people were expecting rate cuts, as you said, some people expected as many as 10 rate cuts. We've seen 150 basis point rate cut now in the last month. So we have the rate just hovering around 5, the Fed funds rate. So your expectation is that we would not be going back to let alone the zero interest rates, of both the pandemic and back after the great financial crisis. But we won't even be going back to the kind of 2.5 that we maybe thought was kind of fairly sort of had become the new normal. You think we're going to be above that, do you?
I'd be very surprised if we got back to those interest rates with this current policy configuration. And yes, that is not just fiscal, it's also trade policy. It's also industrial policy. It's just the scale of ambition as it relates to the energy transition. This is all very expensive. This requires societal resources. If we're going to build as many data centers as we expect to build, if we're going to power those data centers, the data center share of total electricity consumption is growing at about 1.8% per month. Data centers by 2027 could consume the amount of electricity that the economy of Japan does today. So if we have all these ambitions in all these dimensions, we run a very large deficit, and we're not going to allow for the external sector through trade to meet these demands, I think it would be very surprising to get back to 2.5% base rates.
And again, that's just explained that's because that demand for capital for the kind of investments you're talking about. And there are other factors too, like demographics, right? People talk about other factors. But that in particular, again, we used to talk about back in the 1990s and 2000s, when I covered economic policy, everybody talked about a global savings glut was driving interest rates lower. It's kind of almost like we now have a kind of over demand for investment, which is going to keep, you think, sort of structurally keep interest rates higher.
And you do, because the deficit is so large, that's savings that is being consumed by the public sector. So that's savings that would, and that was, again, the Robert Rubin, Greenspan, Clinton era. It was by reducing the deficit, you increase national savings, you allow more of these savings to flow to productive investments. Again, interest rates fall as a result of the decline in the public savings. So, it's a very different time today. And again, I think that when you think about this policy mix, trade, industrial policy, again, just the natural demand for AI plus a deficit, it's the conjunction of all of that yields what I think is going to be a surprise for many people who think of what they describe as interest rate normalization is going to fall well short of their expectations.
We're going to take a break then. When we come back, I'll have more with Jason Thomas at the Carlyle Group talking about the US economy and what difference it may make to the economy whether Donald Trump or Kamala Harris wins in next month's election.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Jason Thomas, head of global research at the Carlyle Group, about the state of the US economy and its outlook in the next few years. One thing you've written about, very interestingly, is some of these structural changes in the economy and how we need to rethink the way we understand the economy. I think one very helpful way you've thought about this and written about this yourself is, that we perhaps now live, again, in that immediate post-Cold War period when we had this globalization and low inflation and low interest rates. We were kind of consumer-oriented, right, because we were sort of looking for cheap imports and all this kind of stuff. You now think that's changed and we're now entering a kind of an economic area where sort of producer prioritization is kind of the defining feature. Can you explain that? Explain it much better than I can, obviously.
What I would say is that when you think about the subject around which economic policy was oriented for the past 30 years, it was very much the consumer. And so trade policy, regulatory policy, competition policy, antitrust, it was always not attempted monopolization, but actually having to demonstrate consumer harm. So scale in of itself was not going to leave a company guilty of violating antitrust laws. So again, very much an effort to drive prices down. And it worked. Again, the 40% decline in durable goods prices. So even though wages were not growing as rapidly as they had, if you were to adjust wages by durable goods prices, furniture, home electronics, autos, there was actually very substantial growth in real incomes. I think that we've reached a point, and someone suggested that something to the effect of, you may not like President Trump, but you have to appreciate the extent to which his critique has really embedded itself in Washington. And I think that's very obvious.
That critique being, well, explain
Sure.
what you mean
So I
by
think
that.
that just trade, this notion of being ripped off by trade or that not being sufficiently confrontational with some of our large trading partners, of course, most notably China.
Immigration would be a factor here too, wouldn't it? I mean, I'll let you get back to your answer, but there is this view, is quite widely held, that immigration has been very beneficial in terms of contributing to relatively low inflation in the last few years, although, argue the flip side of that is it may have depressed American workers' wages too. But that has been, again, an era of high immigration. We're now probably, whether or not Trump or Harris wins, we're looking at a much, presumably more restrictive approach to immigration. Does that fit into this idea too?
I think that that's one of those questions that's ultimately state dependent.
Right.
What I mean by that is I think it's inconceivable that services inflation would have fallen as rapidly as it had without this big influx of immigration. The question is, on a steady state basis, now that we've gotten inflation down to much more normal levels, what level of immigration is required to maintain lower inflation rates? And I think that more would be better if you're focused solely on inflation. I think that there's questions of political equilibrium and all those sorts of things. But I think that it's very obvious that immigration played a major role reducing inflation. And of course, we can talk about President Trump's proposals with across-the-board tariffs, 60% tariffs on China. But even, if you go back to 2019, then Vice President Biden was suggesting that one of his first orders of business, if he were elected, would be to get rid of the Trump tariffs on China that I think he described as senseless, that were penalizing American farmers, American consumers. Of course, once in office, not only were the tariffs left in place, they were applied to a broader swath of goods. Tariff rates in many cases were increased. And of course, export controls were introduced. The industrial policy we've described, clearly President Trump wouldn't have oriented that policy towards green industry, renewable energy. But the basic structure of the programs in terms of providing domestic subsidies for industrialization, again, very similar to what President Trump talked about. Of course, you had a bipartisan infrastructure act. So all of these things, to me, they've changed this orientation where now it's the welfare of the worker.
Yeah.
And so if you had more of the real income gains, more of the purchasing power in the past that came from disinflation, from lower prices, today, more of that real purchasing power gains are going to come from faster wage growth. And I think it's something that people see all around them. They recognize in the politics. They just have not yet really appreciated what this means for some of the economic statistics on a going forward basis.
Final question, Jason. We've got an election coming up 3 weeks now. Very unclear what the outcome will be. We want both the White House and control of Congress. Give us your assessment, if you would, of what's at stake here in terms of the two economic platforms, Harris, not for the Democrats, and Trump and the Republicans. You hear the critique, particularly from Democrats, that Trump's policies would be damaging and inflationary. He wants to, again, raise tariffs again. He wants to restrict immigration. He seems to adopt a rather bullying tone towards the Federal Reserve, all of those things. And he's also another big tax cut, going to extend the 2017 tax cuts in their entirety and add more tax cuts he wants to do. Harris is more fiscally restrained. She's not going to renew the tax cuts except for those earning less than $400,000 a year. We don't quite know, frankly, where else she stands on some of these other big issues like tariffs and stuff like that. So as you look at it, without saying what's going to be better for the economy, what to your mind are the key differences that could impact the way the economy develops depending on who wins on November the 5th?
Well, I do have to reiterate at the top that I think that we live in a time of such polarization in terms of the electoral coalitions, in terms of social, cultural policies, in terms of just the aesthetics of the two parties, that we're really inclined to think that everything is like that. But yet, there is this consensus that has emerged on many of these topics that I've mentioned as it relates to trade and industrial policy, very large deficits that are just not a source of concern, it seems, for anyone is running for office today. So I do think it's important that we separate this economic policy discussion from the broader polarization we see. Secondly, with President Trump, there is no statutory authority for a 10 to 20% across-the-board tariff. One time, a president instituted a 10% across-the-board tariff on a temporary basis, but that was Richard Nixon. It was in the midst of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. We were running out of gold. It was a national declaration of emergency. This is quite to do it on a discretionary basis.
So you think it would require legislation?
Yeah, and which I don't think would be forthcoming. However, I do think the 60% tariffs on China would be possible because the president does have wide latitude to impose tariffs on specific economies that have been found to engage. Whether you agree with those findings or not, there's quite a lot of findings from the Commerce Department that could be then used to justify those tariffs. There may be people who would oppose a 60% tariff, but one doesn't get the sense that they would be willing to spend political capital to oppose it. So I actually do think the risk with the tariff proposals is actually the China-specific, which actually probably are legal, and President Trump would be inclined to impose them. I think the issue there, is this just punitive? Is this just sort of introducing some chaos into the bilateral relationship? Or is this an effort to reach some sort of grand bargain? And there have been many people who've suggested that.
It looks like classic art of the deal behavior.
And former USTR Bob Lighthizer has made some suggestions on this front. So I think that that's the uncertainty here. As it relates to Vice President Harris, when you look at the tax proposals, it does seem that they're based very much on looking at an income distribution and trying to, how much can we possibly extract from those that are above the 99th percentile. So you see corporate income taxes, and we can debate the incidence of corporate taxes, but that rate would go up. Then capital gains rates would be higher. Also potential for, although very difficult to administer, a tax on unrealized capital gains above, very high net worth thresholds. This, of course, would reduce the after-tax income of the corporations. It would reduce the portion of that after-tax income that ultimately finds its way to shareholders. It could be very negative for the market. What I think is interesting is that the markets are not behaving as though this is realistic. And I don't get the sense that the vice president is really campaigning on these proposals. It's just sort of, here's a fact sheet in case you want to know how we're going to. So
it's like the evil grocery stores price gouging as well. It sounds good, but it's not going to actually materialize. So again, just to summarize, you're right, actually, that despite the kind of heavy polarization, there isn't dramatic difference on economic policy. But it sounds as though you think that, the tariff side could have some damage to the economy if Trump were able or willing to go that far. But again, you think it's probably more of a sort of almost a sort of a negotiating or kind of national security position. And on the Democratic side, those proposals, again, if they ever actually materialize, would be quite harmful to market confidence, corporate confidence. Is that the sort of key variables that you think about?
Yeah, in some ways, it's just a question of one side wants to raise revenue through tariffs. They could be economically destructive in some ways and create real challenges to the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. Also, again, have an impact, although one time for the most part, it's like a VAT, a one-time impact on consumer prices. And then the other side, I think the risks are mostly related to, and again, it's just arithmetic, that if there's less after-tax income generated by the corporation, and then even less of that income ultimately is available for the owners of that corporation, that there would be some proportional decline in the market value of those equities. And as I said, I think what's interesting about that is you have a stock market that is not really treating those proposals as though they're all that likely to be enacted.
And so, again, it fits in with your larger picture that there is this sort of almost bipartisan or kind of, independent of politics. There are these big sort of secular structural change in the economy, making it more sort of, as you say, worker, producer oriented, whoever wins in November.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really very important to understand this. And even when you think about the focus on Trump and tariffs, well, perhaps the biggest policy change, which occurred a few weeks ago, not just the imposition of 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, but also an outright ban, effectively, on Chinese EVs entering the market, because no Chinese car that uses Chinese software that can connect to the internet will be imported. Well, that's like saying you can have all the iPhones you want as long as they don't run on Apple software. Of course, there's a hardware-software integration that means that effectively they're not going to be allowed in. This is justifiable to provide breathing space for domestic producers to improve their EVs and reduce their costs. But it's something that, when you think about it on a 5-year forward basis, that is eliminating a lot of prospective disinflation. I mean, these are very low-priced autos. I think in the U.S., when you compare EVs to traditional ICE cars, you see that they generally are priced at a very significant premium. In the Chinese market, in many categories, the EVs are actually the cheaper option.
Yeah.
And so, even that, where you have the tariffs as a political issue, it's still where the tariffs today and some of the trade policies are actually being effectuated are already having the same sort of impact.
Jason Thomas, thanks for very, very clearly, admirably explicating these big changes that are going on in the economy. Jason Thomas of the Carlyle Group, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thank you very much indeed for joining me again. Please do tune in again next week as we get closer to the election, when I'll have another conversation with someone about the biggest topics that are driving the concerns of voters and indeed more broadly of the world. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Speak to you next week.